Nosy Bitch Squad is back for day 7 of the George Wagner the Fourth trial in Pike County, Ohio. Let's get into the information we found out in day 7. There's a lot. Alright, today the majority of what we heard was from the pathologist, a Dr. Karen Luman, who did the autopsies for all 8 members of the Roden family following the murders, and she was a great witness. Honestly, she was very well spoken, very, very good at explaining things that may not have been easily understood by just a lay person. I understood a lot of what she said, but there were still a couple of things that she had to explain for me to understand them. So let's get into what she said today. So today she only focused on Chris Sr. for like 80% of the day, and then we did a little bit of Gary. So we were in scene 1 today still. And then at the very end of the trial today, we went back to Special Agent Fortner, who did the Faro scanning on Chris Sr.'s property. We cleared up a couple questions about the Faro scanning, and then he moved on to beginning to describe the property, and actually he finished describing a 360 description of Frankie and Hannah Hazel's property. I have pictures today. So here we have her drawing of Chris Sr. Yes, Chris Sr.'s head wounds. She did state that there were 5 gunshot wounds to his head. She, of course, has no way of determining the order of them, but she did say that any of these would have been fatal, and gunshot wound number 4, I believe it was, caused what's called internal decapitation, where it severed his spinal cord. So you can pause, take a look at that. Here's the side view. We see there is one kind of on the back of the head, the side of the head. There's one in the ear, bottom of the chin. Right here, kind of in a line right here, right beside here, there's a line of them that were fired in rapid succession. And she later gets on to the distance from which they were fired. But she believes that at this point, these wounds here in a row were most likely fired after he was already dead, or at the minimum unconscious, because he did not seem to react to them. Chris Sr. also had a wound to his forearm that basically blew his arm apart. That was from a high-powered weapon or rifle. These were from handguns, part 2. All right, we're back, part 2. Let's get into some more of what she found. Here is an x-ray that she showed of Christopher Roden Sr. That is a fragment of a bullet that was lodged in his shoulder. And she did point out that if you look up here, that is a piece of a bullet as well, if not a full bullet. We, of course, didn't see a lot of these images today. We just saw the ones that weren't inappropriate, blood covered. So we didn't see all that she was referencing to, but they did show actual pictures of the wounds that were taken during the autopsies as well. I forgot to add, she is at the Hamilton County, Ohio Coroner's Office. That's over north of Cincinnati. That is where we send murder victims for autopsy. Not just murder victims, but anybody who's passed away that needs an autopsy under any kind of suspicious circumstances. That's where they go. And in Pike County, they do not perform autopsies at all, so all autopsies are sent out. She did point out that he had a wound to his forearm that was fired from a good distance away. That was from a high-powered weapon, most likely a rifle or a shotgun. That was the only wound he had that was not fatal. All the other wounds would have either been immediately fatal or eventually fatal within a day or 2 of the incidents. She said that the forearm was so destroyed and lacerated that the skin was peeled back. You could see the muscles. You could see the fractured pieces of bone in there. There was so much trauma, you couldn't see the entrance and exit wound, and his arm was barely hanging on to the end of his elbow, which is super gross. If he had lived, she said the arm probably wouldn't have been repairable, and that there were a lot of bullet fragments still in there, so that had this been the only wound he had, he probably would have lost his arm. Interestingly, there were also tiny pieces of wood that were embedded in his face. He was shot a total of 9 times, 6 times in the head and face, once in the chest, once in the abdomen, and once in the forearm. She said obviously all of the face and head wounds would have been fatal. Well, I guess not obviously. People get shot in the head and live all the time for some reason. But she said all of his would have been fatal. The one in the chest would have also been fatal, and the one in the abdomen would have been fatal within a couple of days because it did pierce both his large intestine, small intestine, liver, and his right kidney. So he would have probably died from sepsis from that within a few days of the injury had it not been taken care of properly and whatever. So head on over to part 3. The prosecution did most of the questioning today. Angela Canepa was back up today, and she did much better today than she did in the opening statements. I thought she did a great job in opening statements, but a lot of people have been complaining about it and don't think that she did a very good job. So that's, each person's opinion. The prosecutor asked the pathologist, Dr. Lumen, what her opinion was on why the wood pieces were embedded in Christopher Sr.'s face. She said that basically this wound wasn't shot from far away. So had he had his face near something that was made of wood, the basically shrapnel would have gone in there. And then he did have another one that should have exited. I believe it was down near his chin. It should have exited, but it didn't, and you could feel it. And she said that happens a lot of times, that if that was one of the later wounds after he had fallen and he was on the ground, that the floor would not have allowed it to exit. So that could also be what the wood splintering is from, or it could have been from a high-powered weapon, and could be tied to the high-powered shot that came from outside most likely and hit the door frame. If you remember, we went over the door frame with Special Agent Hanshaw. He showed pieces of the door frame that were shot from outside. This is quite possibly my favorite thing that's happened in this trial so far. I took a screenshot on YouTube when Judge Randy Deering was told that the white area near Christopher Roden Sr.'s eye was actually a type of fly eggs. Homeboy is disturbed. Next, Dr. Lumen went through several pieces of evidence. She did remove some of them from the bags, but not all of them. This was the sweatshirt, the Big Bear Lake Family Resort sweatshirt that Christopher Sr. was wearing. It does contain bullet holes that she pointed out, and it is coated in blood, even though it is hard to tell just based on the color. This is the t-shirt that Christopher Sr. was wearing underneath his sweatshirt. This is graphic. I'll put a trigger warning here. This shirt is gray, kind of a greenish gray, and it is absolutely coated in blood. She did note that when she got him out of the body bag, out of the refrigerated truck, into their refrigerated area, that he was in the same position that he was found by Deputy Hanshaw and put into the body bag, in that same position with his arms up over his head, and his shirt and sweatshirt were bunched. In removing his clothes, she also noted that a couple of unfired rounds fell out of the clothing and made, I think, one that was fired. So head over to part 4 and we'll get over to Gary. All right, we're back for part 4. Start off with Judge Randy Deering's face when she pulled that green-gray shirt out of its bag. He does not have a poker face, that is for sure. A couple of things that were pointed out on cross-examination a little bit later, but I'm just going to kind of lump them together like person in person. That way we're not jumping around as much as we were yesterday. The defense clarified the distances between contact, loose contact, intermediate distance, and indeterminate distance. Pretty helpful. Most of them were shot pretty close. Gary had one wound that she thought was fired from a distance, but it was actually indeterminate for various reasons. So some things that she noted, she did go over the clothing that he was wearing. He did have $10 and some change in his pocket, some other things. He went And she noted that he had a very foul odor. And when asked if it was from the blood or from the wound, she said that he hadn't bathed in quite some time, that it was an actual body odor that the other victims did not possess. She also stated that Chris Sr. had no teeth. I assume that he wore dentures. She didn't mention anything about dentures, so he might have had them out at the time of his death, but he did not have teeth. And for the love of God, I hope when I die and they do have to do some autopsy on me, I don't have a toenail fungus that gets brought up in court, because poor Christopher Sr. had to have his toenail fungus outed in front of everyone. She did also do a toxicology report on Chris Sr. and on all of the victims. Chris Sr.'s initially came back positive for caffeine and benzos. It was later tested that was a false positive on the benzos. Basically, she stated that these tests are made for the living, not the dead, and upon further testing, he was negative for everything except caffeine. She did note that Chris Sr. and Gary's bodies had way more decomposition than the rest, and if you remember from yesterday, that does line up with Hanshaw saying that these bodies laid in their house for almost 24 hours or longer than 24 hours before they were removed, just based on the amount of evidence at the scene that had to be processed. The defense tried to establish how long they had been dead. She basically told him she had no way of knowing that. There were too many variables, too many factors. She had a general idea that they had been dead for less than 48 hours, but she could not pinpoint it based on a lot of information that she did not have. Head over to part 5 and we'll get into Gary. All right, part 5, we are into Gary's autopsy results today. These are not quite as detailed, and Christopher Roden Sr.'s wounds, to me, he was for sure the first one attacked and incapacitated pretty quickly. His seemed overkill, and honestly, I don't know that George shot him. The way that this man was attacked, maybe one of the boys shot him from outside coming in. I feel like the handgun wounds that were sustained to his face and the overkill in the amount of times that he was shot screams this is personal. I think that Billy shot him, and then I do believe they also said in the opening statements that the boys were having to calm Billy down, and that he was saying things like he had just killed his best friend, which doesn't seem super friendly to me, but it seems very, very personal. All right, on to Gary Roden. Toxicology was done on him as well. All of this was done by the same doctor. Before I get into that, she received the body Saturday morning at 5:50 a.m. when they were entered into the cooler at the Hamilton County Coroner's Office, where she works. She was on call that weekend. She did receive all of the bodies. She performed all of the autopsies. She did the females on Saturday, the males on Sunday, and Chris Sr. had his own his own individual autopsy on Monday, just based on the extent of his wounds and the overkill of his wounds. Gary Roden was shot 3 times in the head. Those are the only wounds that he obtained that night. One of which entered into the back of his head. That was one that we talked about yesterday about the New York Jets hat, that the bullet entered through the back, exited through the forehead, and lodged into the bill of a New York Jets hat. They did talk about the hat that he was wearing, and that it did create a hole in the back of the hat. And Lumen replied that it was possible. I guess she didn't have the hat. It was found in the kitchen floor. So they asked if that evidence would line up with the evidence that was on the Jets hat. And she replied that it was possible. They then handed her the Jets hat, Canepa did, and asked her if that was consistent with the injuries that Gary Roden had. And she said that yes, that it would have been consistent with the injuries that she saw. Head over to part 6. We'll wrap this up. Part 6, hopefully the last part. I don't know why I said last part. I forgot there's a whole other witness we have to go over, but I can get all his summed up in one. Here is the diagram from the same Dr. Lumen of Gary Roden's injuries. Pause to zoom in and take a look at those. She did say that one of his wounds, this one right here, she noted the modeling around it that she could not confirm, but it did in fact look like a contact wound, so it would have been right up against his temple. Gary's skull was fractured in several places from the force of the bullets. Any of the 3 shots that he obtained would have been fatal. Of course, the defense asked again with Dr. Lumen if she had any way of knowing the order of the gunshot wounds. She said she did not. And then they went through on a large notepad that I assume they're going to keep using for the remainder of the trial. My Instacart orders here. To go over the distances of the wounds. Last thing on Gary, he was also found with his shirt pulled up, consistent with the drags. We went over that. And his toxicology came back positive for caffeine, which was the Mountain Dew can in the yard. And it also came back positive for cocaine, which there was cocaine in the safe. This is not the first time we're hearing this. And I've theorized for a long time that I think Gary was high, because unless 2 of them started shooting simultaneously, to shoot both of them, I feel like one of them would have reacted, and I feel as though Gary was too high to react if he was even aware of what was going on before a fatal shot was fired. As far as the distances from the shot, she said that Chris Sr. did not have any contact wounds. 6 of the shots created loose contact, and 1 was intermediate contact, which I believe was 3 inches to 3 feet, depending on the type of weapon. Contact is 0. Loose contact, she said, could be anywhere from 1 millimeter to 1 inch. Intermediate was 3 inches to 3 feet, depending on the type of weapon used. And 2 more were indeterminate, including the shot that shredded his forearm. And she used the word shredded several times to describe his forearm. Gary sustained 1 contact wound, which we're pretty sure is the one to his temple, 1 intermediate wound, and 1 indeterminate, all to the back of the head. They did not show Gary Roden's clothes, but all of his wounds were to his head, and they did show the Jets hat. So this is a good place to cut off right here. I'm going to cut this one off here, go into one more video that describes the crime scene of Frankie Roden with Hannah Hazel Gilly by BCI Special Agent Todd Fortner. So go to the last part. Part 7, last part for today. I have some crime scene pictures of Frankie and Hannah Hazel's house from BCI Special Agent Todd Fortner, who was in charge of that, which is called Scene 2. We will go over that. The prosecution elected to stop when he was done showing those pictures, as it was a good stopping point, because tomorrow we will start getting into the inside of the trailer. First up, we have the outside back door. If you notice, there is a sledgehammer on the ground, and then further up here, kind of right behind my fingernail right there, there is a pair of pliers. He did initially take these into evidence because at the time he did not know what was part of the crime scene and what was not. Here is a close-up picture of that sledgehammer, and it was shown in court today as a piece of evidence. Here are the pliers on the back door. Here is a zoomed-in picture. If you look kind of right here, you can tell that that seal of the door has been damaged. He said he did not think that the damage looked fresh. For what it's worth, the trailer that I lived in, I locked myself out one day and used, I don't remember what I used, a crowbar or something trying to get back in. And that's exactly what my door looked like with me trying to pry it back open. And for what it's worth, I was not able to get myself back in. Here is Fortner discussing the dog pen underneath a closed window, and then outside of the dog pen there are some air conditioning units right here underneath an open window, and he is pointing out moss patterns under this closed window versus the moss patterns underneath this window that were disturbed. Here is a closer view. They said in court you could see it, but obviously we are getting a recording of a screen. But if you look super closely, kind of right there, you can see a little white triangle in the middle of some darker stuff. He said that was the disturbance of the moss that was underneath the window. And this would explain how the dogs did not necessarily attack them, because the dog pen ends right over here. And there are several things that they could have used to climb up in there. Last picture for today. This shows the dog pen. There is a loose dog. Here's the air conditioner unit. You can kind of see that is the open window. That was the closed window. These were chicken pens. That basically was the entire outside of Frankie's residence. He showed a truck bed that he said he did not collect anything from, because he did not see anything that had been disturbed and that was potentially evidence. Excuse me. He also pointed out that the damage on the door, I don't know if I said it earlier, but the damage on the door did not look fresh and looked like it had been there for quite some time. So I will see y'all tomorrow. Questions, comments, feedback, leave it in the comments down below, and we'll see you tomorrow.